Our first speaker is Jim Sterba. And Jim Sterba is author of Nature Wars, the incredible story of how wildlife comebacks turned backyards into battlegrounds. He plans to give an historic overview of wildlife and forest destruction for 400 years, how the conservation movement reversed its beginning at the end of the 19th century, and how the post-World War II sprawl of people into the suburban, exurban, and rural countryside created an integration of regrown forests, rebounding wildlife, and dispersed people that is unique on the planet. He'll cover how ideas about nature and wildlife were formed, how modern Americans became denatured, and why fights about overabundant wildlife, especially deer, are going on in literally hundreds of communities. Fights between people over too much of a good thing and what to do, and what not to do about it. He'll end by covering a typical community fight over deer that lasts, in his experience, 5 to 10 years.
As Ryan said, I'm going to talk this morning about two things, mainly the comeback of forests and wildlife in this country and the increasing people-wildlife conflicts that have resulted. The return of deer and geese, beavers, coyotes, turkeys, bears, and other wild creatures amounts to a huge 20th century conservation success story, which is worth celebrating. But instead, what we do most of the time, or as often as not, is to fight about whether we've now got too much of a good thing, and if so, what to do or what not to do about it. And we fight because our attitudes about nature and animals are all over the map. Some people say, leave nature alone, it will balance itself. I say nonsense. We're all managing nature, the nature around us, like crazy, whether we know it or not, for good or ill. The question is, how do we do it? Our attitudes about animals have been shaped in many ways by when and where we grew up, what we experienced, what we read, what we saw in movies and on TV, by new research and newfound compassion. It's very likely that more people live in closer proximity to more wild animals and birds and trees today in the eastern third of the United States than anywhere on the planet at any time in history. The conservation movement nurtured the return of trees and wild creatures far beyond the dreams of its founders. We fostered natural wealth much of the world would envy, and that's truly wonderful news. Unless perhaps you're one of 3,000 to 4,000 drivers that will hit a deer today, or your child's soccer field is carpeted with goose droppings, or coyotes are killing your pets, or your neighbor's cat has turned your bird feeder into a fast food outlet, or wild turkeys are chasing your mailman, or beavers have flooded your driveway, or bears are looting your garbage cans. So how did we get here? As Ryan said, for the first 400 years after Columbus, we destroyed forests and killed off wildlife until the early 20th century, when we began to put a stop to both. And then after World War II, people drained out of cities and quit farms and sprawled across the landscape. And the result, again, is an integration of forests, rebounding wildlife, and dispersed people on a scale that's unique. In the last half of the 19th century, wildlife slaughter and forest destruction was so egregious that it became known as the era of extermination. By 1900, the people population stood at 76 million, and most wild animal and bird populations had been reduced to remnants or worse. Conservation has not only stopped the destruction, they slowly reversed it and began bringing forests and wildlife back. In just the last 150 years or so, huge forests grew back. And as I say in my book, we became a nation of forest people. As David Foster, the head of the Harvard Forest, says, not since the Mayan collapse 1,200 years ago, when cropland reverted to jungle, have we seen a regrowth of American forests like we've seen in the eastern U.S. Ever since Henry David Thoreau and George Perkins Marsh began writing about nature, that writing has been largely framed by a narrative of loss. What I mean is that this writing is saying the landscape is being ruined and it's our fault. And while this may be true or mostly true, it's not all true, and it's certainly not true about our forests. To bring wildlife back, conservationists didn't get out of nature, they got into it. They slowly put an end to market hunting. They created wildlife refuges and imposed harvesting seasons, fair chase rules, and bag limits on trappers and sport hunters, what became known as the North American model of wildlife conservation, in which all the wildlife belongs to all the people, not just landed aristocrats as in Europe. By 1960, we were evenly split, about 1/3 urban, 1/3 rural, and 1/3 suburban. By the 2000 census, over half the population, an absolute majority, for the first time, live not in cities or on working farms, but in this vast middle muddle that is called sprawl. Some people say our conflicts with wildlife are our fault because we encroached on their habitat. And that's true, but it's only half the story. As their populations multiply and spread, wild creatures encroach right back. And the reason is simple. Our habitat's better than theirs. We offer up plenty of food, water, shelter, edges, and protection. We plant trees, grass, gardens, shrubs. We put out birdseed, mulch, and garbage. We fill up dumpsters. If you happen to find yourself in an unsecured dumpster at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's a good bet you won't be alone. All this amounts to a giant buffet for all sorts of critters, and it's the reason that sprawl's biological carrying capacity, that is the population limit the food and habitat can sustain, is far greater than in an unpeopled forest. The rub for many species is what's called the social carrying capacity, which is the tipping point when the annoyance or damage a creature causes outweighs its benefits in the public mind. And that's when elegant creatures get demonized and fights about them turn nasty. Here's a question I ask people. How did we become so denatured? We spend 90% of our time indoors, in our homes, cars, and our offices. How many of you have been to a deer problem meeting? If you've missed one, let me walk you through one in a place I call East Burbia. First thing that happens is a few residents begin telling stories to one another about deer problems. Fenders crumpled, gardens eaten, new cases of Lyme disease, and town officials pick up on this talk, and in the name of good government, they decide to schedule a public meeting to discuss deer, at which the shouting starts early. They totaled my wife's car. I say kill them all. We love seeing deer. They ruined my garden. Put up a fence. The ticks are so thick my kids can't play outdoors. How can you talk about killing such majestic creatures? Something has to be done. The deer have just as much right to be here as we do. Who says we have too many deer? How many deer do we have? The officials adjourn the meeting, promising more discussions at the next session, but they realize that this is a political hot potato and vote to do the right thing. Hire a consultant. His job will be to study East Burbia's deer herd and report back in 6 months, which is conveniently after their next election. The consultant presents his $15,000 study, and it says, guess what? East Burbia has a deer problem. It has too many. It needs to kill some. But being sensitive to burbia speak, he can't use the K word. Instead, he recommends a systematic program of human-directed mortality. At the next meeting, a resident arises to announce the formation of a new coalition called East Burbians Against Murder, which got organizing help from a national animal rights group. Animal rights people say lethal management doesn't work because it creates empty space that others move into, the so-called vacuum effect. And that's true. As populations grow, they spread. But in the case of deer, it can take many years. Apply this logic to gardens, the most managed landscapes I know. By the logic of the vacuum effect, we wouldn't pull the weeds out of those gardens because new ones are just going to grow right back in. At another meeting, someone rises to say birth control is the answer. Contraception always comes up because it holds out the possibility, the promise of sparing animal lives. Deer contraception is a humane alternative to killing if only it worked. It may become tomorrow's silver bullet, but practical and affordable contraception was just around the corner 30 years ago. Someone wants to know what's wrong with sharpshooters. Sharpshooters raise the hackles of hunters who view them as competition. So from the back of the room, someone shouts, "Sharpshooters are mercenaries. They're no better than assassins." This person turns out to be a member of a hastily formed new local group, Humane Christian Family Bow Hunters of East Burbia. Somebody says, "Bring back natural predators." For some reason, lots of people seem to overlook the other major deer predator, us. And this is very new and very unique. Studies suggest, in fact, that since the last ice age, humans probably killed more white-tailed deer for food, clothing, and other uses than all other deer predators combined. In just the last few decades, for the first time in 11,000 years, sprawl man has put huge swaths of the white-tailed deer's historic range off limits to its biggest predator. We've largely taken ourselves out of the working landscape, and we've mostly forsaken both the destructive ways and the stewardship skills of our ancestors. But the comeback of wildlife and forests all but demands that we reconnect to the natural world that is right out around us. We relearn old skills and develop new ways of practicing those skills better. I think there ought to be wild places where we leave nature alone or mostly alone, places we visit or study but don't stay. But we're ubiquitous on much of the rest of the landscape, and we're already manipulating it for good or ill, whether we know it or not. And I think we have a responsibility as a keystone species to manage the ecosystems around us for the good of all their inhabitants, the plants, the animals, and even the people. And I think we can probably do a better job of it than can white-tailed deer.